Thank you guys for joining us on this lovely Tuesday. So today we are going to jump into a topic of what is called seller financing, and it's really something that's been happening since the beginning of time, right? Now it's taking this market by storm because dynamics right now have really shifted in the favor of, well, it's just really sideways. I wouldn't say it's favorable here or there, but main thing is that we are utilizing every creative solution that we can to make things happen, right? So we're going to go into what is seller financing as well as what are wrap mortgages. So getting into that, seller finance note is essentially where you as a seller become the bank, right? You fill in the shoes of the bank and you then allow or sell your property and have a note created with the buyer. Right now, there's some seller financing transactions where you don't use an agent. We highly recommend that you do at the end of the day, just because if you're not knowledgeable as to all the terms and things of that nature, it can be a bit more legwork. Now, that being said, full disclosure, this is a disclaimer here. We do I am only a real estate agent. I recommend that you, if you have any questions that require an attorney or CPA, that you please deal with those individuals. And if you don't have any, we'd be more than happy to connect you with the resources that we have. That being said, back to the fun stuff. Pros and cons, right? Now, synopsis of seller financing. Seller becomes the bank. Buyer is the end buyer and things like that. And moving on to what is, that's the easy peasy, right? Now, going in that manner of seller financing, there's many ways you can work it. You could even do it with having debt on the first home, right? Or on your home, you would still be able to use seller financing if you owe on your home. We would then call that a wrap mortgage, right? Now, when we're talking, why would someone do, the whole idea of seller financing and things like that? There's many ways folks can do this, and then pros and cons as well. Now, sticking to the seller side for now, why would a seller want to do a wrap mortgage or a seller finance note? First and foremost, in this market, when people don't want to pay 7% on the interest rate, right, for the buyers, or they, as a seller, bought a home, a year or two ago and now are underwater, unfortunately, and need to relocate or get out of whatever circumstance they're in with their mortgage. This is where it gets critical to think outside of the box, especially when the market's not giving you the number that you're looking for. So what do sellers do in this kind of market? If you're underwater, that's where you'd want to explore the options of maybe doing a wrap mortgage, right? So what is a wrap mortgage? To give you a synopsis, a first debt, which is your debt, Mr. Seller, you have your debt here that's in first position with your bank. You then have what is a new note or mortgage that is created underneath your first debt, right? So let's say that your first debt is $2,000 a month, right? That's what you pay on your mortgage because you got a 3.25 on your interest rate. Jealous. Then you go and create a second mortgage or note, which is paying you $3,000 instead of $2,000, which covers or wraps around your first original debt, right? In second position. So you have then created a new debt that you've wrapped around your first one. Why you would do this is mainly to ensure that you get out of that purchase that you're in and you have someone take care of your note at the end of the day. Now, there's, like I said, pros and cons to that we'll get into here in a second. The other great thing about seller financing, though, is if you don't have debt on the home and you own the home free and clear, now you get to make not only principal but interest at the same time. Why? Because not only do you get to charge that you get what is owed to you, but you get to charge an interest rate as well as the bank because you are the bank, right? And man, let me tell you, the creativity that you could use behind seller financing is a beautiful thing for both the seller and the buyer, right? Because I like to say that you essentially have a bit of a blank contract where you and the buyer can negotiate anything and everything on that contract, right? So if I've seen some seller finance notes and wraps where you can have as much as 50 to 100 or if not more down, or situations where folks aren't doing anything down, right? It's really up to you and the seller at that point, because no appraisals tend to be involved either. At the end of the day, though, as long as you have the trusted resources behind you, you can work it just like a bank transaction if you really wanted to as well. Now, those are the two biggest pros when it comes to selling as a seller, why you'd want to utilize seller financing or a wrap mortgage. On the buy side, I mean, you can negotiate a lot. You can essentially evade the whole 7% interest rates and get yourself something a lot more favorable when we're talking interest rate. Not only that, you still could make a great deal with when it comes to down payments and things of that nature, and just making sure that you can still make things happen. Getting into the more pros for the buyer. Let's say you unfortunately had circumstances that took you to a place where you had to get a bankruptcy, or you had jobs that weren't necessarily as consistent. You could use seller financing as a way to really get away from having to do too many revisions on income documentation, right? Depending on how the seller and you negotiate those things out. But as the seller is the bank, there's some situations where if you can just show enough income, you don't necessarily need to show income documents. Do I recommend it? That not really. But at the end of the day, that's why you want to have a resource like me or anyone, a trusted real estate advisor next to you to make these things happen, right? You don't want to just willy-nilly sell the home to any end buyer. That being said, due diligence is key. Or let's say you had a circumstance with your credit and you need to get things picked up on that end. You can still make things happen with a seller finance or a wrap note. Or let's say on the flip side, you've used every conventional loan product you can think of as a buyer: FHA, conventional, VA, USDA, jumbo, any other DSCR loan, whatever the case may be. You can utilize seller financing to a point of endless amounts. I mean, at the end of the day, there are no limits because there are no banks, right? So you could buy as many properties as you want, right, as a buyer. And on the flip side too, as well, really just added onto that note, is that if you'd made the numbers work on the spread and made sure the margins made sense, I mean, as an investor, it's a great way to purchase because you can negotiate the interest rate, you can negotiate the down payment, you can negotiate the monthly payment, you can negotiate the amount of years, you can negotiate the amortized table. At the end of the day, you can negotiate almost everything, right? Or even add clauses that you wouldn't even think of adding. I once had a client that added in the contract as a buyer, represented the buyer here, where he didn't necessarily have the down payment then in the exact necessary amount. So he worked up something out with the seller where he paid what is a certain amount annually at the end of the year, right? I think it was around 15 to 20K additionally at the end of the year to make the numbers work for him on the down payment and be able to spread the time on his money at the end of the day. And it made sense, and for him, and the seller, it worked out. So that's the beautiful thing that you wouldn't be able to do on a traditional sale and things like that. Now, transitioning back to the seller on what other situations could arise on why someone would want to sell on a seller finance or a wrap mortgage is, the opportunity to pay less in taxes as well. When you're a seller, traditionally, when you sell your home, you get a lump sum, right? And you have to pay capital gains tax. And compared to if you sell on a seller finance note, you don't necessarily get a lump sum. You do, though, because you're not receiving a lump sum, have a way to postpone or evade capital gains tax depending as to how much you're gaining from the sale, right? And to give you a general summary as to how much it costs to sell in a traditional transaction, I mean, that can be anywhere from 9 to 11%, right? Compared to with the seller finance note, you can really narrow that down to practically only 3% if you play your cards right, in the sense of what title company you choose to work with, what since there's no banks involved, you save money on the appraisal there and things like that. Main thing though is that when you sell on a seller finance, there's definitely more gain to be had if you are patient, right? That being said, if touching on the wrap mortgages, if you don't have equity and you need to sell, that's the other factor that we had talked about there. And it's a great way too, if God forbid, when you do sell as a seller finance note, you are able to really double the amount of money that you make, in the sense of, if the buyers for some reason, don't cooperate in the mortgage on the seller finance note, you can always not only keep all the funds that they paid, but you also can get the property back, right? And then essentially kind of do it again. And it's just a matter of you just looking at all the options to see what made sense. We'd be more than happy to get that for you. Now, as we spoke about, with the seller finance, it's the beautiful thing about all of it is that the creativity that you have in the contract, the ways, the clauses that you can add, the stipulations that you can take out, whatever the case may be. Now, who are the participants in the seller finance transaction, right? Jumping into that, and why it's important to have a good team behind you. And here at Elite, you can always rest assured that we have all the connections from step 0 all the way to closing, and then even after. What do I mean by that? Well, when you sell on a seller finance note, since you don't have a bank, one of the key things that we still recommend that you have, right? Because you have, your seller, I'm going to use this as the title company, and the buyer, right? They can see that, right? Perfect. So that being said, you as a seller here, and this is the buyer, and this is the title company. When you go about selling it, you still want to have a title company to ensure the funds get transferred correctly as they should, right? So the buyer would pay the title company pays the seller, and all that good stuff. Now, when you have a seller finance note, you have the option of doing it without a third-party loan servicing company. Do I recommend it? No. I recommend that you have a third-party loan servicing company that stays in between you and the buyer as a seller, right? Because after you close on the transaction, you want to make sure that there's proper documentation that shows that you sold the home as a seller, so you can show that financially or monetarily the liability, you're not responsible for it, because you have a note that's being serviced, right? And if you want to buy another home as a seller, that would be your statement or documentation that shows that you aren't taking care of that debt anymore. And as a buyer, you have the security to make sure that all the funds are going to the right places, and the seller doesn't just keep your money and run away and not pay things correctly, right? And this is a scenario of doing a wrap, right? So if it's a wrap, this is how it would work out. You want to have that third-party loan servicing company in the middle to ensure that there's proper documentation and things like that is being taken care of. This third-party company will receive the funds, and then this will be the bank. So when the buyer pays the third-party loan servicing company will pay the seller the amount that's necessary, and then pay the bank what's left. First it'll pay the bank what is owed to it, and then pay what's left over to the seller, right? So it'll go buyer, third-party loan servicing company, bank, and then what's left, the third-party loan servicing company will give that to the seller. So that being said, you still have, things like insurance that you want to make sure is taken care of, and that's where, insurance and property taxes will be administered by the third-party loan servicing company, right? And in that sense, that's how a wrap mortgage would be. Jumping into how a regular seller finance transaction would be, you wouldn't have to have a third loan servicing company, third-party loan servicing company in the midst if the home is paid off free and clear. As a seller, you could go just with the buyer on that. Typically, the buyers will pay for this third-party loan servicing company because it'll protect both parties, and it can be anywhere from like $10 to $100 a month, just depending on the company you want to go with. And yeah, at that point, that's essentially the biggest things about the participants in the transaction. Um, some frequently asked questions that we have here is, what happens if the buyer doesn't pay? Well, as a seller, if it's a wrap, right? Talking about wraps right now. If it's the buyer not paying you on the seller, you are still going to be held liable for that debt, right? Because at the end of the day, your debt is still in first position while your second mortgage is in second position. With this is the wrap, right? Wrap around second mortgage. First debt. If the buyer stops paying this one, you are still liable for that first lien, right? So you want to make sure that you have some reserves as a seller in this situation. Now, a lot of people get worried about that if the buyer doesn't pay and things like that. Well, at the end of the day, it really does also depend how you mitigate the risk. Are you vetting the buyer before you just sell it willy-nilly to any buyer that has money, right? You want to make sure that, and that's where we really help our clients at the end of the day thrive through these means of seller financing or wrap mortgage, because we actually take the time to vet the buyers, and you can do this as a regular seller as well. To vet these buyers, make sure you get their financial information and things like that to help mitigate that. Now, if the buyer just doesn't pay and things, really go left, essentially you would get the house back. You would have to repossess the home. And there's clauses that you can add to, shorten foreclosure and things like that, or you can keep it the way it is. But there are solutions if the buyer doesn't pay. Worst case scenario, you keep all the funds that they paid to you, you get the house back, right, as a seller. The second question we have here is a frequently asked question is, why do we need to use a loan servicing company? Well, at the end of the day, guys, you want to have a loan servicing company just for the sake of having documentation and to make sure there are no funds being commingled or moved in a certain manner or not distributed to the proper places, because that third-party loan servicing company ensures that all the money goes to where it needs to go correctly. And if you're selling, it's a great way to show that you're not legally responsible for that debt that you're paying for, right? Or that the buyer is paying for. The next frequently asked question we have here is, how long will the loan be in the name of the seller? That's a great question. At the end of the day, it all comes down to a very key term that I highly recommend you add into your seller finance notes, and that's called the balloon payment, right? So one of the things that folks want to add is that clause, because what it is, let's say, you agree to have this sale and you will add a balloon payment of 3 years, right? So let's say the note is $500,000, and just in a scenario, just to make the numbers pretty, at the end of 5 years, you'll owe, or no, I'm sorry, did I say 3? You can negotiate that between the buyer and seller, 3, 5 years, whatever the case may be. But at the end of that allotted time, 3, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, you will have a balance that is due from those $500,000. Let's say that amount is $400,000, right? And that balance that is due, the buyer will have to pay that in a lump sum at the end of that allotted time, right? So the buyer has 3 things they could do in that situation. First thing they could do, and really the goal here is for the buyer to refinance prior to that balloon note being called, right? Because that way they can evade the whole 7% rate or just a bad interest rate. That's kind of the whole goal as a buyer right now, is like, hey, I know that I'm going to have a balloon in 5 or 7, 8, 6 years, whatever the case may be. But the hope is that in that allotted time, the economy will be better and rates will be better and buyer will be able to refinance and get out of that balloon situation. Second, and pay the seller off completely, right? So, because when the buyer goes to refinance with the bank will pay the seller what's owed. The second thing that would happen there is that the seller then has the choice to either renegotiate with the buyer to see how long or how they want to work it, as to what the situation may be like on that balloon, if they want to extend it, not extend it. Yeah. The last thing that could be done is that the seller says, no, get out of my house, I am taking the property back, and that's that, right? If the buyer does not come up with a way to pay for that balloon at the end of those years. Now, the chances of that happening, as long as you keep a good relationship with the bank and the seller, I mean, we're not looking to get the property back at the end of the day, right? Just like banks. Banks aren't looking to get the property back. They'd rather work with you than to work against you, as long as you communicate as a buyer, right? And that being said, we did have a real life example. I don't know if the folks are seeing that there. Let me know when they can see it. Okay. Yeah, guys, we did want to show you guys just a bit about what these numbers could look like. This is a little calculator that we use to help our clients get these estimates. So, for example, if you own the property free and clear, right, you would get a down payment here, purchase price. You sold it, let's say, for example, $400,000. You get a down payment of $40,000. That's your loan amount. The interest rate that you give is a 5% because you're like, hey, you know what? I want to sell this as quick as possible, and it's better than the bank. And the buyer's happy because he's not paying 7% on the interest rate, and he doesn't have to go through all the hassle of an appraisal and all the documentation that banks ask for and stuff like that. And you can set a term length of an amortization table of 30 years, or you do 40 years or 10 years, whatever you like to do. And as you can see, the monthly payment that is going to be given to the seller on a monthly basis will be $19.32 in this example, if I read that correctly. Yeah, $19.32. And that's just principal and interest, right? So to calculate the taxes and insurance, you will want to make sure that you as a seller and you as a buyer do your own due diligence with your transaction. And as we can see over here to the right, that is the amount of balloon balances that one would owe at the end of the whatever time, if it's a year or 4 years or 7 years, at this table or payment table or method. This is the amounts that buyers would have to, in this situation. Now, the beautiful thing about that is that all these numbers are subject to change. I mean, you can go in there and negotiate. I had a client, get a 3.5. I've had clients get as high as even higher, maybe an 8. Right on the interest rate, just depending on the seller situation and the buyer situation. Main thing though is that you have flexibility with this that you don't have with a traditional sale. That's the biggest thing, and if it's the most beautiful thing about selling on a seller finance or a wrap mortgage is that, right? Now, I don't know if we happen to have any questions there for us.
We don't have any.
Okay. Well, guys, keep in mind there are many more pros and cons that we'd like to touch on, but to keep it short and sweet for you guys, give you the main thesis and the main points that you guys need to know, please feel free to reach out to us to get more information and schedule a consultation. We'd be more than happy to give you an informational meeting. And may you guys have a blessed Tuesday.